I have told this story once before, to a JAG recorder in a prefab debrief room on Corsair Station, 11 days after it ended. The recording is sealed. The version I'm telling you now is the one I carry, which is different in the way that anything you survive always differs from the official account, not in the facts, but in the weight. The facts are these. On the 14th day of the third month of the unified calendar year 2341, the Vel-Kareth ordained executed 37 members of the Orvani royal retinue aboard their diplomatic flagship, the Vel-Sar Immaculate, in a locked ceremonial hall 12 decks below the command spine. They called it a sovereignty audit. They broadcast the notification to 6 neighboring systems within the hour, which told you everything you needed to know about how long they'd been planning it and how little they feared the response. They miscalculated. I was in the antechamber when it happened. I didn't see the executions themselves, but I heard them, a low pneumatic concussion that the ship's environmental systems tried to mask with a faint harmonic tone, the way you'd run a ventilation fan to cover a smell. 3 sets of concussions, 9 seconds apart, measured and organized. 37 people. I counted the gaps later after, when I had nothing else to do but sit in the dark and reconstruct what I'd heard through a sealed hatch. My name is Davin Orell. At the time, I held the rank of Staff Sergeant in the United Earth Marine Corps, Ground Division, attached to the office of the Human Ambassador to the Orvani Sovereignty, which was a posting that had existed for precisely 14 years, and had never, in that time, required anyone with my training to do anything more demanding than stand at parade rest for extended periods and look composed. Ambassador Harais Caladrin was a careful, patient man who genuinely believed the Vel-Kareth ordained were manageable. He wasn't stupid. He was simply working from an older model of what manageable meant. He was in the ceremonial hall when the concussions happened. He was not among the 37. The Vel-Kareth made a calculated decision to leave the human observer alive, which they believed would demonstrate a species of restraint. They were correct that it demonstrated something about their intentions. They were wrong about which something. I was in the antechamber because Her Serenity Orvantale the Younger, Queen Regent of the Orvani Sovereignty, had requested a private word with the human delegation before the ratification ceremony began, and her protocol officer, a small gray-feathered man named Siveth Lure, whose precise calm I still think about sometimes, had indicated that it would be appropriate for the Queen's security detail and the Ambassador's security detail to wait outside the inner chamber together. I was the Ambassador's security detail. There were 6 of the Queen's personal guards. We'd been standing together for approximately 20 minutes, which was long enough for me to note that one of the Orvani guards, the one with a silver rank clasp on his left shoulder, spoke a few words of trade common, and that the antechamber smelled faintly of a resinous compound I couldn't identify that reminded me, irrationally, of cedar. Then the concussions happened. The Queen's guards heard them before I did. Their auditory range extends lower than ours, and the Vel-Kareth had modulated the pneumatic frequency specifically for the band their own species perceives as inaudible, a calculation that didn't account for Orvani hearing. Later I understood this was because the Vel-Kareth had studied us carefully. They had not studied our allies carefully at all. They'd made a catalog of human thresholds and planned around them, and in doing so they'd revealed exactly how they thought. We were the variable worth accounting for. The Orvani were furniture. The guard with the silver clasp turned to the inner chamber door 1 full second before I heard anything. He said something in Orvani that I didn't speak, but the register of it needed no translation. Then the second set of concussions came, and every one of the 6 guards looked at each other, and then they looked at the door to the outer corridor, and I watched a decision get made without a single word. 3 of them went for the outer corridor immediately. The other 3 hesitated for perhaps 4 seconds, which I mention not to condemn them, but because 4 seconds is a long time when you can hear through the walls, and what they could hear was something I still don't have the right word for, and they went anyway. I went to the inner chamber door. It was sealed from the inside, which meant the Queen had heard the first concussion and locked herself in, which told me she was rational under pressure, which was the only thing I needed to know right then. I knocked in the pattern we'd been given for the duration of the visit, 3 short, 2 long, and said my name and the ambassador's name and the phrase, "secure hold," which was Orvani diplomatic terminology for a protective situation in progress. Then I waited. The door unsealed after 11 seconds. I went inside. Her Serenity Orvantale the younger was standing in the center of the inner chamber with her hands at her sides and her face entirely composed. She was approximately my height, with the pale cream and violet feather coloring of the Orvani ruling caste, and she was wearing the formal ratification garments, which were layered and heavy and clearly not designed for rapid movement. Her protocol officer, Siveth Lure, was beside her. He had a small personal communicator in his hand. He looked at me, and then at the door I'd come through, and then at the communicator and said in trade common, "The others." "Gone," I said. He closed his eyes briefly. "The hall." "I don't know. I need to secure this room." He translated that, I assumed, because the Queen said something in Orvani and he replied, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professionally controlled despair. The look of someone doing the arithmetic on a situation in real time and not liking the totals. She asks, Siveth Lure said, "How many are with you?" "Just me," I said. "My name is Davin Orel, Staff Sergeant, United Earth Marine Corps. I was assigned to Ambassador Caledron's detail. The ambassador was in the ceremonial hall." I paused. "I'm going to stay here until I receive instruction from Earth. Does Her Serenity understand?" He translated. She replied, he said, "She understands. She asks if you know what has happened." "I have an inference," I said. "I'd rather not state it until I can confirm it." The Queen looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something directly to me in Orvani, not to Siveth Lure, to me, and waited. "She says," Siveth Lure said quietly, "that you don't have to pretend. We know what the sound was." I nodded. "Then yes, I know what happened." I moved to the inner chamber's secondary hatch and checked the seal. "I need you both to sit down and stay away from the exterior walls. I need to access the room's environmental controls, and I need you to tell me everything you know about this ship's internal layout." We had been alone in that room for approximately 40 minutes when the Velkarath ordained sent their first delegation. There were 5 of them, 2 administrative functionaries in formal gray and ivory vestments, and 3 soldiers in the pale, articulated armor the Velkarath used for internal ship security. I should describe the Velkarath because most people in 2341 still hadn't seen one in person, even with the diplomatic contact that had been established in the prior decade. They are tall, significantly taller than humans, averaging perhaps 2¼ meters, with an elongated bilateral symmetry that looks almost familiar until you notice that the proportions are wrong. The torso too long, the neck too short, the limbs jointed at angles that suggest a different evolutionary path to bipedalism entirely. Their skin is a pale ivory gray, smooth and faintly reflective, with patterns of darker pigmentation that shift very slowly across minutes rather than seconds, in ways that correspond to emotional states, though I didn't know enough then to read them. Their eyes are large and amber, and they blink from the outer corners inward, which is a very small thing that takes some getting used to. The senior functionary. He introduced himself as Oversecretary Tailvoreth Khan, though the syntax of Velkarath naming convention meant I wasn't sure if that was a personal name or a rank designation, stood at the sealed door and spoke in trade common, with a precision and fluency that told me the Velkarath had been preparing for this interaction for a long time. "The Human Security Liaison," he said. "Staff Sergeant Orel, we have been made aware you are in attendance." "Yes," I said through the door calm. The ratification ceremony has concluded. The Velsar Immaculate is preparing to depart. You are welcome to remain aboard as a diplomatic observer through the duration of the transit, or you may arrange for a shuttle transfer to any vessel of your choosing currently in the approach corridor. It was a very clean offer. I want to acknowledge that. It was precise, and it left no obvious opening for refusal, which was exactly how it was designed. Ambassador Caledron, I said, what is his status? A brief pause. The ambassador is being escorted to comfortable quarters for the transit period. He is unharmed. I'd like to confirm that directly. In time, Sergeant, there are administrative formalities to complete first. Her Serenity Orvantale is in this compartment, I said. I've been assigned to ensure her safety. I'll remain with her until she's been returned safely to Orvani territory. The pigmentation patterns on Oversecretary Tail Voreth Khan's face shifted. I didn't know what it meant. I noted it. The Queen Regent is a guest of the Vel Karath ordained, he said. She is in no danger. The sovereignty audit has been completed. There are matters of succession and administrative continuity that require her cooperation, and the Vel Karath are prepared to extend every courtesy during the transition period. You are welcome to return to your ship. I'll stay, I said. Another pause, longer this time. That is not a practical arrangement, Sergeant. I imagine not, I said. I'm staying anyway. They tried 3 more approaches over the next 2 hours. The tone escalated from courteous to businesslike to something that wanted to be threatening without quite committing to it, which told me the Vel Karath didn't have a clear protocol for this particular scenario. They'd prepared for the massacre. They'd prepared for human diplomatic outrage. They hadn't prepared for a single non-diplomatic individual who wouldn't negotiate and wouldn't move. After the 4th approach, they stopped sending delegations. They cut environmental support to the antechamber, not to the inner chamber which had its own independent circuit, but to the space outside the door. It was a message. I received it and didn't change anything I was doing. In the inner chamber, Her Serenity sat with her hands in her lap and spoke quietly with Sivithlur for a long time, and then she didn't speak for a longer time, and I didn't interrupt either state. There is a kind of grief that demands witnesses, and a kind that demands the absence of witnesses, and I had enough sense to recognize which one I was looking at. On the 2nd day, she asked me through Sivithlur why I had stayed. I thought about the answer for a moment before I gave it. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give her the actual one rather than the diplomatic one. Because the people who were supposed to be here left, I said, and I don't leave. Sivithlur translated. She was quiet for a moment, then she said something. She says, Sivithlur told me, that the Vel Karath will not let you leave now even if you wanted to. I know, I said. She asks if that concerns you. Less than the alternative, I said. She looked at me for a long time after that. The Orvani have golden eyes, large and very clear, and they hold eye contact longer than humans typically do, not as aggression but as attention, as a form of genuine presence. I held it. After a while she said something else. She says, Sivithlur said, and his voice was different on this one, quieter, more careful, that she understands now why the Vel Karath were so precise in their planning against humans. Why? Because you are the ones they couldn't find a category for. I didn't answer that. I went back to monitoring the door. On the 3rd day they sent Oversecretary Tail Voreth Khan again, alone, without the soldiers. He sat against the wall outside the sealed door and spoke through the comm in a register that had changed, less formal, more direct. The pigmentation patterns on his face were doing something I still couldn't read. Sergeant Orell, he said, I want to speak to you practically. All right. You understand that the Vel Karath ordained are not, by disposition, a cruel civilization. What occurred in the ceremonial hall was a calculated political action. The Orvani sovereignty has been in administrative decline for 11 years. Their territorial claims overlap with 3 Velkareth expansion corridors, and their leadership structure has consistently refused to ratify the agreements that would resolve this. The sovereignty audit was not an act of malice. It was an act of governance. I was quiet for a moment. 37 people. 37 individuals whose positions required resolution. The Queen Regent remains alive and will continue to hold a nominal role in the administrative structure of 37 people, I said again. Sivath Lure gave me their names. Would you like me to read them to you? The patterns on his face shifted. That would not be productive. Probably not, I said. I'm staying anyway. He was quiet for a while. Then, what is it you believe you are accomplishing? It was a genuine question. I could tell from the tone of it, the slight shift in cadence, that he actually wanted to understand. The Velkarath are not stupid. They were operating from an incomplete model, but they're not stupid. I'm keeping a commitment, I said. She's under my protection until she's safe. That's what I'm doing. The probability of that outcome is not favorable. I've worked in unfavorable probability before. He was quiet for a longer while. Then, Earth will not respond militarily to an internal sovereignty matter. The Velkarath have reviewed all available data on human diplomatic precedent. Your government has never initiated armed conflict over a third-party territorial dispute. That's accurate, I said, but this isn't a territorial dispute. What is it then? I thought about whether to answer. I decided it didn't matter whether he understood in advance. The understanding was coming either way. This is the part where you killed our allies, I said, in a locked room, while we were standing right outside. He didn't respond. After a while he left. On the 4th day, Ambassador Caladrin's voice came through a low-frequency comm channel I'd been monitoring. The Velkarath weren't aware I had the equipment for it, because it was embedded in my uniform rather than any device I'd visibly carried. He was alive and unharmed, as they'd said. He gave me a brief status in the clipped phrasing we used for comm silence conditions, which told me he'd been aware I'd have this channel. He said Earth had been notified. He said to hold position. I told him I had it. He said there will be a response. I said I knew. He said Davin, just my name. He'd never used my first name before. I said, I know, sir. The channel went quiet. I went back to the door. On the 5th day, the Velkarath cut primary lighting to the inner chamber. We were on emergency reserves, which gave us approximately 40% of normal light levels. Her Serenity had barely slept in 5 days, and the reduced light hit her harder than it hit me. I gave her my field sleep kit, which is designed for a human physiology, but functions adequately for Orvani because the core component is just a thermal layer and a surface that distributes pressure evenly. She looked at it for a long moment. The sergeant, Sivath Lure said, translating without being asked, appears to be giving her Serenity his bed. Tell her it's standard issue, I said. I don't need it. This was not strictly true. But she needed it more, and I had training for running on less sleep than a human being is supposed to function on, which is a thing Earth Marines develop not through any special biological advantage, but through sheer accumulated practice with bad conditions. We are not, as a species, particularly hardy in any individual physical sense. We adapt. We learn the edges of what we can tolerate and we push them slightly further each time, and then we operate in the space we've made. That's the thing most species miss when they try to calculate us. They look for physical superlatives. They study our maximum lifts and our fastest sprint times and our threshold heart rates. They build a model from the numbers and they trust the model. What they don't have a measurement for is the variable that matters. How far past the edge will function anyway, and for how long and without complaint, and with a specific quality of settled determination that is not anger and is not bravado, and is not the desperate courage of someone who doesn't understand the situation. It's the operating mode of someone who understands the situation precisely and has simply decided that the situation doesn't change anything. The Vel'Karath had built a model. It was a good model for what it measured. It did not measure what I was doing. I stood at that door for 9 days total, and I want to be honest about what that was like. It was cold. It was dark. I had 3 days of field rations, and I stretched them to 5 by eating partial portions, which is uncomfortable in a specific and persistent way that I do not recommend. I slept for approximately 4 hours in every 24, in 30-minute intervals, sitting against the wall with the door comm set to alert on any sound outside. The Vel'Karath cycled the oxygen content of the antechamber, not low enough to be immediately dangerous, but low enough to produce a persistent headache that I worked through by breathing slowly and deliberately and not thinking about it. After my rations ran out, I went 2 days on water from the inner chamber's emergency supply, which was designed for the Orvani metabolic profile, and tasted of something between chalk and salt, and something else I never identified. They tried cold, they tried hunger, they tried the oxygen and the dark and the headache and the waiting. Each day they checked, through some sensor I couldn't identify, whether anything in the room had changed, whether the human had moved toward the door, toward the comm, toward anything that looked like the beginning of a negotiation. Each day I had not. They were trying to find the threshold, the level at which I decide this wasn't worth it. They didn't find it because it doesn't exist. That's not a boast. It's a description of how I was built, by the core, by the years before the core, by the particular set of conditions that shape a person into someone who stands at a door rather than walks away from it. I'm not unusual among Earth Marines. I am actually quite ordinary among Earth Marines. That's the important part. Not that I'm exceptional, that what the Vel'Karath were encountering in me was the baseline. The thing they ran their measurements against every day for 9 days was a staff sergeant doing his job. That's all it was, and it was enough. On the 6th day, Her Serenity asked Sivath to teach me some Orvani words. I think she did it to give him something to do, which was kind of her, because Sivath was not handling the confinement well, not through any weakness, but because protocol officers are people of routine and structure, and he'd been cut off from every routine he had. The grief for the retinue was in him constantly. I could see it, held in the precise tension of his posture and the careful way he chose each word when he spoke. He had known all 37 of them. He had worked alongside most of them for years. He'd been the one to give me their names on the 2nd day, reading them from memory in a careful, clear voice, and I had written each one on the back of a comm form with a stylus he'd lent me, and he had watched me write them without saying anything. And then he had gone back to sitting beside the Queen, and I had gone back to the door, and neither of us had mentioned it again. He kept the grief controlled and professional, which was, I came to understand, not suppression but service. The thing a protocol officer does when there is still someone who needs his function. Her Serenity needed him functional. He was functional. That was the decision, and he made it every hour, and I respected it the way I respect any form of the thing I know how to do. He taught me the Orvani words carefully and with genuine attention to my pronunciation, correcting me with the patient precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing things that required exactness. I was not a good student. My mouth doesn't make some of the tonal distinctions Orvani requires, and Sivath spent a considerable amount of time on the 7th day explaining to me, with great diplomatic care, that what I thought was the word for mourning was in fact a mildly obscene term for a specific category of administrative failure. I was not offended. He seemed, for a moment, almost amused. It was the only moment in 9 days that I saw anything approaching lightness in him, and it was brief, but it was real. My Orvani remains, to this day, functional at best and embarrassing at worst. But it gave Sivath something to hold on to, and it gave me something to do in the hours when there was nothing to monitor. And the Queen listened to these lessons with an expression I can only describe as watching two people try to build something in a room that was otherwise empty. On the evening of the 6th day, she spoke to me directly in Orvani, without looking at Sivathluer first. I understood two of the words. One of them was the word Sivathluer had taught me that afternoon, the word for stay, and one of them was the Orvani word for thank you, which has a different weight in that language than it does in trade common, a weight that implies something owed and something received, and something that cannot be fully repaid, all at once. Those two words were enough. On the 7th day, Over-Secretary Teovoreth Khan came back. He was alone again. He sat outside the door for a while without speaking, and when he did speak, he asked me something I hadn't been asked before. "Sergeant Orel," he said, "do you have family?" "Yes," I said. "Do they know where you are?" "The Corps knows. The Corps will have informed them of the situation." "Are you not concerned for them? For what it means to them, if this does not resolve favorably?" I thought about that for a moment. It was the most human question anyone on that ship had asked me, and I considered whether it was a manipulation or a genuine inquiry, and I decided it didn't matter. "They know what I do," I said. "They knew when I joined and they knew every year since. This is the job." I paused. "And besides, I'm going to walk out of here." "You cannot know that." "I know what I know," I said. "And I know that 37 names are in Earth's record now, and I know what Earth does with names." He was quiet for a long time. The patterns on his face ran through a slow cycle. "You have a great deal of faith in your government's response." "I have a great deal of knowledge about what my government does when someone kills our allies and broadcasts it," I said. "That's different from faith. Faith is when you don't have evidence. I have evidence. 11 years of it if you count from the Calder Compact. I have the precedent of every time someone looked at the data on our diplomatic responses and decided that data covered all the scenarios." I paused. "It never covers all the scenarios." He left without responding. On the 8th day, the Velkarath sent a different kind of delegation, not Teovoreth Khan, a soldier. He stood outside the door and didn't speak through the comm. He spoke out loud, at a volume he knew I could hear, in trade common, and what he said was a careful and detailed description of what would happen when the Velsar Immaculate reached Velkarath space and the administrative phase of the sovereignty audit began. I want to be clear about what this was. It wasn't a threat in the conventional sense. It was information, delivered precisely, about outcomes the Velkarath considered inevitable and were willing to describe in advance as a means of demonstrating their certainty. It was the Velkarath version of showing you the math on a situation and expecting you to agree that the math was correct. I sat against the wall on my side of the door, and I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I said through the comm, "Are you done?" A pause. "Yes." "Thank you," I said. "I'm staying." He left. Her serenity had heard it through the door. When I came back into the inner chamber, her face was composed in the way I'd come to recognize as her working register, not numb, not detached, but controlled. She said something to Sivathluer. He translated. "She asks if you believe Earth will come." "Yes," I said. "She asks how you can be certain." I thought about that. "Because of what they did," I said. "Because of how they did it. Because they left 37 names on a broadcast that 6 systems received. Because they called it an audit." I paused. "The Velkarath have very good intelligence on human diplomatic precedent. They don't have good intelligence on what happens when you do something that doesn't fit inside diplomatic precedent." Sivathluer translated. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked through him, "And if they don't come in time?" "Then I'll have done what I could," I said, "and someone will know we didn't leave her." She looked at me for a long moment, the golden eyes steady and clear. Then she nodded once and went back to sitting with her hands in her lap, and I went back to the door. On the 9th day I heard it. Not through the comm, not through any instrument, through the hull. It's a specific sensation, a change in the resonance profile of a ship in deep transit when something significant happens to the space around it, a mass emergence, a series of them, close enough and large enough to create a perceptible interference with the local gravitational gradient. I'd felt it before, in training and in 2 prior deployments. It feels like the ship taking a breath and holding it. I stood up. My legs had gone partly numb from sitting against the wall, and I noted that as a physical fact and moved past it. I went to the door calm and said to whoever was in the corridor outside, "Do you feel that?" No one answered. "That's the 13th Reckoning Fleet," I said. 340 warships. I want to make sure you understand that number. 340. Silence from the corridor for a moment. Then the sound of rapid movement, not toward the door, away from it, receding down the corridor in both directions. I went into the inner chamber. Sivathluer looked up from whatever he'd been doing. He'd taken to cataloging the contents of the chamber as a way of occupying himself, a meticulous inventory of every item and its Orvani designation, which was the most Sivathluer thing I could imagine him doing and which had produced, by my count, 14 pages of careful notation on the back of the communication forms he carried in his vest pocket. Her serenity had been resting. She was sitting up now, very still, with the precise alertness of someone whose body has recognized a change before the mind has finished processing it. "They're here," I said. I want to describe what that moment was in the room. There was a very long silence. Sivathluer put down his inventory tablet. Her serenity looked at me and then looked at the outer door and then looked at me again. The emergency lighting made everything amber and flat, and the resinous smell that had been with us since the beginning was still there, faint and persistent, something from her formal garments or from the Orvani materials in the room, and I thought again of cedar, which was irrational, but the mind goes where it goes after 9 days in a small space. "Earth comes," Sivathluer said, not a question. His voice was different from the way it had been for 9 days, not louder, but different, the way a taught thing sounds different when the tension in it changes. "Earth comes," I confirmed. He translated. Her serenity was quiet for a moment, then she spoke. "She says," Sivathluer said, and his voice broke slightly on the first word, which was the only time in 11 days that I saw anything crack in him. "She says she will remember the name." "Tell her the feeling is mutual," I said. The ship changed around us over the next 4 hours. The Velkareth are not a species that panics, nothing in their evolutionary makeup selected for the rapid onset high-amplitude fear response that humans and Orvani both have, the one that throws you sideways and makes you loud. Their panic is internal and organized and very thorough, which in some ways is worse, because it looks like competence right up until it becomes something else entirely. I could hear, through the hull and through the door, the organized movement of a species executing contingency plans that hadn't included this particular contingency, reworking the math of a situation that had just changed all its variables at once. What I could also hear, underneath the organized movement, was something else, a quality of sound in the corridors that I'd been in enough difficult situations to recognize. Not fear exactly, the Velkareth don't process it the way we do, but a functional equivalent, the sound of a species that has encountered information it cannot resolve with the model it was using, and is now running a different kind of calculation. The calculation that answers the question, what do we do now that we know? What they knew was this: 340 warships, for 1 Marine and 1 ally, not a response to an attack on Earth, not a response to a human casualty, not a response to anything the Velkareth intelligence files categorized as a casus belli under any recognized framework. A response to the killing of people who were not human, on a ship that was not Earth's, in a system that was not ours, because those people were ours in the way that matters more than territory. We had given our word. The Velkareth had excellent intelligence on our diplomatic responses. They did not have intelligence on what happens when you treat a commitment the way you treat a filing discrepancy. The 13th Reckoning Fleet had not opened fire. They had done something more specific. They had positioned themselves in a dispersal pattern around the Velsar Immaculate and every other Velkareth vessel in the approach corridor, 12 ships in total. And they had transmitted one message, fleet-wide in Velkareth, Trade Common, Orvani, and 6 other regional languages. I got the text of it from Ambassador Caladrin through the low-frequency channel, who'd gotten it from the fleet directly. I've memorized it because it is one of the precise and perfect things ever put in a transmission, and I intend to remember it until I don't remember anything. It was not long. It said, "You killed the Orvani Queen's retinue aboard a sealed ship. You filed it as an audit. You broadcast it to 6 systems. You have one of our Marines in there with her. We have all of your ships surrounded, and we will hold this position until Her Serenity Orvantale and Staff Sergeant Davin Orel are aboard our vessels, unharmed. After that, we will discuss the sovereignty audit. The 13th Reckoning Fleet does not have a timeline for this discussion. We will wait as long as we need to. No ultimatum with a countdown. No demand with conditions attached and an expiration on them. Just a statement of what was and what would happen next, delivered in the manner of someone describing weather. The manner of something that has already made all its decisions and is simply informing you of them. Oversecretary Tailvoreth Khan came to the door 2 hours after the transmission. He came alone, without soldiers. The pigmentation patterns on his face were doing something I hadn't seen before, a rapid cycling, pale to dark and back, faster than the slow drift I was used to seeing in him. And Siveth Luer would tell me later that this pattern, in Orvani cultural study, corresponded to what their scholars called the reckoning behind the eyes. The state of a person confronting information that restructures everything they thought they understood about the shape of the world they were in. He stood outside the door and didn't say anything for a long moment. I waited. In 9 days I'd learned Tailvoreth Khan's silences, the calculating silence of the first day, the probing silence of the third, the organizing silence of the 7th. This one was different from all of them. This was the silence of a person who has finished calculating and arrived at a result they did not want and are now standing in it. 340, I said through the comm, for 1 ally and 1 Marine. The Velkareth ordained, he said slowly, did not anticipate this scale of response. No, I said, you anticipated the diplomatic response. You have 11 years of data on our diplomatic response. You were very thorough about it, I could see that from the first conversation. You done the work. You knew the parameters and you operated inside them. I paused. You don't have data on this response because we haven't done it in your lifetime. It's been a long time since anyone gave us a reason to. You're saying we gave you a reason. You killed 37 people in a locked room and broadcast their names to 6 systems and called it paperwork, I said. Yes, you gave us a reason. He was quiet for a long time. The patterns on his face cycled slowly through the pale-to-dark range and settled somewhere in between. What does Earth want? Earth wants Her Serenity Orvantale transferred to the 13th Reckoning Fleet's medical vessel within the hour. Earth wants Ambassador Caladrin transferred with her. Earth wants the broadcast of the sovereignty audit retracted from all 6 receiving systems within 6 hours. I paused. And Earth wants the names of all 37 members of the Orvani retinue entered into the Velkareth public record as individuals wrongfully killed under color of administrative authority. Full names, ranks, and the circumstances. Permanently. The patterns on his face had gone very still. Those are the terms for the fleet to stand down. No, I said. Those are the terms for this conversation. The terms for the fleet to stand down are a separate matter that Earth's fleet admiral is prepared to discuss with the senior Velkareth authority aboard this ship. I'm a staff sergeant. I'm not the right person for that conversation. I paused. I'm just the person who didn't leave. Another long silence. His voice, when it came, was different from any register I'd heard in him before. Not angry. Something else, something the Vel-Karath don't have an easy word for, and that I don't either, but that I recognized as the sound of someone standing in front of information they can't get around and have stopped trying to. You understood that Earth would send a fleet, he said. I knew they'd respond, I said. I didn't know the specific number. 340 is more than I expected, to be honest with you. But then 37 is a specific number too, and you broadcast it. You wanted the 6 systems to know. You wanted the record to be clear. I let that sit. The record is clear. A silence. Then, in a different tone, not the administrative voice, not the political voice, something that had the quality of a genuine question from a person who genuinely wanted to understand. How long have you known it would end this way? Since the 4th day, I said, when you told me Earth wouldn't respond militarily to a third-party territorial dispute, because you were right, we wouldn't, and this isn't one. He put his hand against the door, one long pale hand, the fingers slightly too long, the joints slightly wrong, and held it there for a moment. I don't know why. The gesture didn't map onto anything I could interpret, and Sivath Luer would say later he didn't know either. Maybe it didn't mean anything interpretable in any language. Maybe it was just the motion of a person reaching out towards something that was already decided and couldn't be otherwise. The way you'd put your hand on a wall in the dark, just to know where you are. The Vel-Karath ordained, he said very quietly, will not forget this. No, I said, neither will we, that's the point. He left. The door unsealed 40 minutes later. Not by my action. The Vel-Karath disengaged the lock from their end, which told me the fleet admiral's conversation with the senior Vel-Karath authority had proceeded, and something had been agreed, or at least that something had been sufficiently communicated. I stood up. My body registered its objections, 9 days of wall sitting and partial rations and reduced oxygen, and I noted them and moved anyway, which is the thing I know how to do. I went to the inner chamber and told Her Serenity and Sivath Luer to prepare to move. Her Serenity stood. She was still wearing the formal ratification garments, now 9 days old, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened in them, the layered fabric keeping its shape with a stubborn structural dignity that struck me, in the moment, as exactly right. Sivath Luer looked at his inventory tablet, 14 pages of meticulous notation, and held it for a moment with an expression of precise, contained grief before he tucked it into his vest pocket. He was keeping it. Of course he was keeping it. I went to the outer door and opened it. The corridor was empty. The environmental support had been restored, normal lighting, normal temperature, the recycled but adequate air of a functional ship. After 9 days in the emergency-lit inner chamber, it felt, absurdly, like stepping into something different. Not outside, not free, but different. A corridor with working lights and the right amount of oxygen and no one in it. I checked both directions, clear. I went back inside and held the door and said, "All right, let's go." Her Serenity walked out of the inner chamber with the specific, deliberate composure of someone who has decided, consciously, what their walk is going to look like in this moment. Head level, hands at her sides. The formal garments settling around her with a quiet weight. Sivath Luer was a half-step behind and to her left, which I understood was the formal escort position, and which he had maintained, as best he could, for the entire 9 days. I walked beside her and slightly forward. We walked through the Velsar Immaculate toward the secondary shuttle bay, where the fleet's transfer vessel was waiting. The corridors of a Vel-Karath flagship are wide and tall, built for their proportions, and walking through them as a human feels slightly like walking through something designed for a different species, which it was. The overhead clearance was generous, the ambient lighting uniform and pale, the walls a smooth ivory material that I'd spent 9 days looking at from one direction only, through a sealed hatch, and was now seeing from the other side. The ship felt different. The organized movement I'd heard through the hull had settled into something quieter. Not quiet in the way of a ship standing down from an alert, quiet in the way of a ship that has made a decision and is now living in what the decision means. We passed Velkareth crew in several corridors. Not many. The ship was large, and they had clearly made arrangements to minimize our contact with the crew, which told me the Velkareth had enough political awareness to understand what it would mean to have their personnel standing in corridors, while the Queen Regent they'd massacred the retinue of walked past them. The few we did see pressed to the walls and did not make eye contact. The pigmentation patterns on their faces ran in the rapid cycling that I now understood meant something was being restructured behind those amber eyes. Her serenity did not look at them. She looked straight ahead. I walked my position and did not look at the walls. At one junction we passed a wider corridor and I saw, briefly, through an interior viewport, the approach corridor beyond the hull. The 13th Reckoning Fleet was visible in the distance, too far to count individually but not too far to see the spread of them. A dispersal pattern across the corridor. 340 warships holding position with the particular organized stillness of a thing that is not moving because it has chosen not to move yet. That could move at any moment and has decided this isn't the moment. And that distinction is the most precise kind of power there is. They were lit by the local star, catching light on their hulls in the long, clean light of open space. And the sight of them, the sheer spread of them, the deliberate patience of them, the way they held the corridor the way you hold a breath before you decide what to say, was one of the things I have not found a way to adequately describe in any of the times I've been asked to describe it. Siveth Lure saw them through the viewport. He stopped walking for just a moment. I heard him exhale, a long, slow release of something that had been held in place for 9 days. Then he kept walking, a half step behind and to the left. Her serenity didn't stop. She had already seen them somehow, or perhaps she was simply not going to stop until she was off this ship, which was the right decision and the one I would have made in her position. I kept pace with her. We reached the secondary shuttle bay. The transfer shuttle was docked and open. There were 2 Earth Marines at the airlock, Corporal Nesson, and a Lance Corporal I didn't know, both in full kit, and the sight of them was another thing I don't have a clean description for. The specific quality of seeing 2 people in your own uniform after 9 days in a room with wrong air and emergency lighting, and your own name in a transmission from 340 ships. Nesson looked at me with a very specific expression. "Sergeant." "Corporal," I said. "You look terrible, Sergeant." 9 days, I said. "Let's get her serenity aboard." They moved to escort positions flanking the Queen. Siveth Lure stayed at her left. I walked us aboard. The airlock cycled. The shuttle undocked. The Velsar Immaculate fell away behind us through the viewport, and the 13th Reckoning Fleet spread across the approach corridor in the long light of the local star, patient and vast and entirely decided. And I sat down for the first time in 9 days without calculating when I'd need to stand up again. Her serenity was looking at the viewport. Siveth Lure said something to her softly that I didn't catch. She answered, and then she turned and looked at me and spoke. Siveth Lure translated. She asks, "What happens now?" "To the Velkareth." I looked out at the fleet, 340 ships holding their position in the corridor. The fleet admiral's transmission had said after that, "We will discuss the sovereignty audit." I knew what discussing the sovereignty audit meant. The Velkareth had broadcast 37 names to 6 systems and called it governance. And there is a specific thing Earth does when you do that, which is not the thing the data on diplomatic precedent predicts, because the data on diplomatic precedent is built from situations that fit inside the existing categories, and this situation did not fit inside any of them. "The same thing that always happens," I said, "when someone kills our allies and thinks they've done the math correctly." Siveth Lure translated. Her serenity was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back out at the fleet, at the 340 ships holding their patient dispersal in the corridor, at the specific shape of what Earth had sent and how it was arranged, and she said something final, short, in Orvani. "She says," Sivathluer told me, and his voice was back to its professional register now, calm and precise and carrying something underneath it that I recognized as the particular quality of a man who has decided to be excellent at his function for the rest of his life in honor of 37 people who cannot. That she wishes she had learned, before today, what it means to have a human marine standing at one's door. I looked out at the fleet. I thought about the 9 days. I thought about the 37 names Sivathluer had given me in the inner chamber, read from memory in the quiet voice of a man who had known every one of them, which I had memorized the same way I memorized everything that mattered, not through any trick of memory, but through refusal to let them blur, through the deliberate maintenance of them as specific people rather than a number on a broadcast. I thought about the cedar smell and the emergency lighting and the hand against the door, and the 2 Orvani words I'd learned first. I thought about Oversecretary Teovoreth Khan and his careful mathematics, and his incomplete model of what humans do when you put us somewhere we've decided we're not leaving. "Tell her," I said, "that she knows now." The shuttle locked onto the medical vessel's docking arm. The 13th Reckoning Fleet held its position in the corridor. The fleet admiral's discussion of the sovereignty audit had not yet begun, and when it began it would not be the kind of discussion the Vel-Kareth had planned for, and the 37 names would be in their permanent record before it was done. We did not move until they were.